Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. If you're new here, this is the podcast produced for Strategy International, a global think tank that brings together experts from all over the world that bring incredible insight on matters related to international politics, economy, defense, security, the environment, and much, much more. Speaking of experts, we have another great guest on this show again today, Professor Theofanis Exadaktylos. He's a professor in European politics at the University of Surrey in the UK. He's a specialist, among others, in European public and foreign policies, Europeanization, and politics and crisis. Thank you so much, Professor, for being on the program.
Thank you for the invitation.
We appreciate it, and I know that you're a very busy man. The time that you're taking to share your knowledge is much appreciated. Of course, I want to remind everyone listening or watching that you can visit strategyinternational.org for any information on Strategy International and the great work that is being done over there. Let's get right into it. Just from your introduction, there is one term that is piquing my curiosity, and I wanted to kind of pick your brains a little bit about that. Europeanization.
Yeah.
What is this? What does it mean? And how has it evolved?
Well, I assume your audience would not like to hear the more academic debates around Europeanization. So let me put it in very simple terms. Europeanization is a process that happens as a result of the participation of a country in EU, European Union structures and the institutional architecture of the EU. Therefore, what we say is that the EU as a set of institutions, as a political system, has the capacity of affecting what is happening at the domestic level, on the one hand, in its own EU member states. And at the same time, the EU member states have the capacity of affecting change in what is happening at the EU level. So effectively, we think of Europeanization as this kind of two-way process that is a kind of a chicken and egg problem, if you like, where we never know how that feedback loop goes. But effectively, we are talking about the politics produced at the EU level. We are talking about the policies produced at the EU level, and we're also talking about the impact on identity within countries. And of course, considering my other hat in terms of European foreign policy, we can also consider the Europeanization of countries that are not part of the EU, just because they simply participate in dealings with the European Union. Your classic case can be Switzerland, highly integrated within the European Economic Area, but also countries of Eastern Europe as part of the European Neighborhood Policy, for instance.
It's quite intriguing, this whole concept of the European Union. Arguably, it is one of the more successful unions. But the intriguing thing here is that if we're looking at known federations or confederations like the U.S. or, for example, Canada, they have their own kind of history and kind of uniting in a federation or a confederation, depending on the case. But there's always been this sense of we are American or we are Canadian, and henceforth the union. Whereas when it comes to the European Union, it isn't the case at all. We're talking about independent states that have their own identity, their own national identity and customs and policies and ideologies, and somehow they all fit under one umbrella, which is quite fascinating. I'm not so sure if at the very beginning they even expected this to grow at the level that they're at right now, and even if they had thought of this level of success, if they had ever imagined it to stay united.
Well, let's hold off the question of success for the end of this particular segment, and I'll come back to that. But in order to understand the way the European Union is now, we need to go a little bit back to the origins of it. And here's where the difference with countries like the United States, which is a federal political system, can be a little bit different. So if we think about how the origins of the European Union are located, it's the end of the Second World War. And this was the effort of Europe as a continent to be able to work together and cooperate with each other as independent nations in the context of peaceful neighborly relations. So what effectively was intended in the beginning was for this kind of long-standing rivalry between primarily France and Germany to come to an end. At that stage, though, you obviously have the development of the two camps of the Cold War between East and West. Obviously, Russia was an important ally at the end of World War II, and it wanted its own sphere of influence. So originally, it was 6 countries uniting together in order to safeguard the production of steel and coal. Now, as you can understand, steel and coal is the fundamentals of or was the fundamental element of the military and defense industry in those days. And therefore, this is where the whole story starts. So how does one move from cooperating in one specific area, policy area, that is controlling the production of coal and steel to prevent the exploitation or appropriation of those resources for military purposes, to coming up with what is practically today a political union. So we've come a long way, and this is a history of almost 80 years now, where what we call European integration has been happening. Now, European integration as a bigger story has had its ups and downs, its successes and failures, primarily in the way that this union was conceptualized. It was never intended to be a political union in the classic notion of a federal or a confederate set of sovereign countries or of independent regions or what have you, primarily because, as you described, each state within the European Union brings in its own set of ideas, its own traditions, its own background, and its own histories, effectively. So the baggage there is quite significant. But when we think about the European Union as a project of integration, as a project of peace, then what we are actually seeing is an agreement on fundamental principles and values that bind these nations together. So, we cannot claim here, in Europe, that there is this kind of like European identity in the context that there is an American identity. But what we can definitely claim is that there is something in the air that brings us all together. And we feel this kind of proximity with each other, despite not liking each other at all times. But that, it can happen in the context of the US. Californians may not like New Yorkers, and Texans may not like, the folks from Chicago. So East, West, North, South, we have similar divisions in the context of the European Union. Some countries manage to address certain issues in a more effective way. Some others have difficulties in doing so. We saw how that played out in the European financial crisis some 10 years ago, and how certain outcomes of that can be prolonged into the future. But what is missing effectively from the European Union, and this is part of the original architecture, is the federal principles, right? Although in theory, there is a movement towards those federal principles, federation and federalism are considered F words for the context of European politics. So as you can imagine, whenever some politician or political actor mentions the F word, there is a little bit of commotion as to what the process is about. And of course, when it came down to 2016, when the UK voted to leave the European Union, it was precisely on the principle of this kind of direction of travel, on the federalization of the European Union that the UK had an objection to. So I think, I mean, it's a whole separate issue. We can go into details later on, but in that sense, where we are right now is that we have the European Union. It is a political system in its own right, and there is nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And it precisely advances the interconnectedness of these countries and the way that these countries can cooperate successfully within notions of peace. Now, lately, we have seen this kind of divergence in terms of the common values that bind the European Union member states together. We've seen elements of democratic erosion across certain member states. We have seen the disagreement in terms of the support and solidarity between member states, not only in the context of the European financial crisis, but also COVID-19 as a pandemic, and even in the context of the war in Ukraine that is currently in its full first year. So all in all, we can say that despite its uniqueness and what we would call in academia its sui generis nature, the European Union also has a lot of classic characteristics of any political system that exists around the world. So conflict happens, debate happen. Things are not definitely perfect. Things may be slow moving, problems may not be tackled, but all in all, we can talk about a relative success in terms of what the European Union has achieved, which is precisely what it intended to do. Its members not to go at war against each other, and its members to kind of create some common principles of facilitating cooperation and improving the lives of European citizens at large.
I want to get back to the idea of this European Union based on common values, and it's obviously very difficult when we look at the diversity of all the countries that are member states. Yeah. It would be very difficult to find a common ground on all the countries to kind of agree, but the European Union as an institution seems to be pushing this idea that we do have common values as European nations. And I think that has been brought into question in recent years. You mentioned Brexit. We've seen certain policies taken in countries like Poland and Romania and Hungary that kind of distance themselves from the more EU-centric states, if you want. Italy, very recently, with its latest elections, has been bringing up a lot of question marks as well, even though it's still very recent. And I want to go back to this quote-unquote success story that is the EU. Is this just a bump on the road that eventually will end up disappearing, or is this the beginning of potentially a new challenge for Europe, where countries are looking much more inward than they were, for example, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when they were much more dependent on this union?
One of the founders of what was called then the European Coal and Steel Community, and effectively turned into the European Economic Communities and the EU as we know it now, suggested that the European Union will develop through its own crisis, right? So effectively, what we've seen over the last decade or so, just around the outbreak of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 onwards, is a set of overlapping crises that are happening back to back, and they are challenging not only the notions of our European Union values, but also the ways of doing things in politics altogether, right? And we saw how that played out in the context of the United States. You are, of course, more familiar with that side of things in terms of, populism and the divisions that were created as a result of the election of President Trump. This is something that happened in Europe as well. So it is part of the global trend within politics, this kind of rise of populist ideologies, this kind of rise of questioning of the fundamental and universal values that we should share as a humanity altogether. And of course, this kind of questioning brings about challenges in defending those principles, right? In terms of democratic values, in terms of representation, in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, and of course, in terms of legitimacy. So within that context, yes, the European Union is always challenged by those crises. Some of them become existential. That was the case with the Greek financial crisis, precisely because it was a make or break type of moment. But on the other hand, if we explore crises like Brexit, we saw how that backfired from the original intention, that was the kind of disintegration of the European Union as a system. Effectively, when Brexit took shape after the referendum and in the context of the negotiations, the EU was very flexible in managing to unite its member state in that kind of solidarity, as in we need to stick together because the decision to leave the EU is not a one that leads to a happy ending. Now, fast forward that to 6 years later, when we've had the pandemic and the cost of living crisis and all the energy crisis, we may hear, as being a resident of Britain, we may be actually seeing how, being outside the European Union may have adverse effects rather than positive benefits. So in any case, the point here is that the EU is learning from its crisis. And our discussion today coincides with a couple of things that I'm writing right now in terms of the learning processes out of this crisis. So effectively, what we need to think of here is that each crisis becomes a learning mechanism for the EU to tackle the next crisis. The crisis will never stop happening, right? So effectively, we need to go to the next one, having all the toolkit in our arsenal to be able to tackle it. And so when we look at the Greek financial crisis, for example, it took roughly 3 years for the EU to come up with a comprehensive, consistent plan as to how to tackle the possibility of Greece going bankrupt as a result of its own fiscal problems, and how this could affect the actual workings of the European Union itself and the Eurozone as a common currency area. Now, fast forward this to the pandemic, where we're looking at the transnational, transboundary public health crisis, where the enemy is not necessarily visible, where the enemy is not necessarily someone that you can negotiate with, then you see that the European Union managed to respond within, say, about 3 months and come up with a common sort of policy on how to contain the virus and what kind of extra sort of non-pharmaceutical measures could be there in order to support the aftermath of the crisis itself, in terms of the financial support mechanisms, in terms of the common practices, in terms of even the rollout of the vaccine, and so on and so forth. And then now, if we look at 2022, with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, it took the EU only 3 weeks to respond in a common capacity. This is quite impressive by EU standards, and I'll tell you why. Especially in the context of EU-Russia relations, traditionally what we know is that each member state had its own way of dealing with Russia, right? So Germany had a different policy, Greece has a different policy, France had a different policy, and of course, countries that are neighboring Russia had a different approach to the way they saw their neighbor. So effectively, to bring together 27 countries in 3 weeks to be able to respond to an aggression by Russia into Ukraine, and to respond in a way that the EU has never done before in terms of the political rhetoric there and the narrative that they want to develop, the EU presented itself as a global international relations actor, commonly responding to the Russian invasion, understanding what the principles and fundamental symbolisms are behind its own rhetoric. So, these kinds of realizations did not happen overnight. It's a result of all those previous crises that take us from, taking 3 years to decide on something to 3 months to 3 weeks. Hopefully, the next crisis will be able to have something that will respond in 3 days, and effectively, create the necessary mechanisms within the European Union to be able to effectively respond to crises in the future.
I mean, I guess it also depends on what type of crisis you're dealing with. When you're looking at the situation between Russia and Ukraine, the European Union effectively has a country that invaded European territory. Whether or not Ukraine is a member state, it's still part of Europe as a continent. So it may not have been that surprising that the EU acted that quickly. But there are, since you're an expert in crises as well, there are, following this war, this conflict, there will be potential new challenges that the EU will face, one of which is the energy security. Migration is another one. And, I want to talk a little bit about migration more specifically, but just in general, if we look at the crises that have surfaced in the last maybe, more or less 10 years. You spoke about financial bailouts. We spoke about the ideological differences on the fundamental values that seem to be surfacing as well. Brexit was a big one as well. And then, we're looking forward at, like I said, energy security, migration, and potentially other bigger ones as well. How is the EU as an institution, reshaping itself in order to face these challenges and to mitigate any future ones? I mean, it doesn't take an expert to see that, okay, there's stuff that are going to be coming our way. What do we do? What kind of mechanisms are in place? What is being discussed to make sure that challenges like this don't shake the foundations of this union? I mean, Brexit was something that no one ever expected, and yet it happened. Arguably, maybe now they're looking back at that decision and maybe they're regretting it. But it did kind of shake the foundations of the European Union to the point where people were questioning the credibility of this union. If you have members that suddenly want to leave, how solid of a union are you? So, I mean, there's all these challenges and future ones as well that, the leaders of the European countries must be looking at very seriously in avoiding.
You're absolutely right there. The thing that we know of the European Union is that it's not an anticipatory type of policy maker, right? So the European Union does not anticipate the crisis. Yes, of course, everybody knows things will happen in the future. I mean, we are anticipating a lot of events happening around climate change, for example, and the climate urgency and the climate crisis as such. We are expecting things to happen in terms of the energy security side of things. We are expecting another pandemic in some time from now, as it's commonly done. However, the European Union is more of a reactionary type of policymaker. That is not necessarily a bad thing. However, it does slow things down, and this is why I mentioned the idea of learning from previous experience and being able to just have the capacity and the toolkit to respond to future crises. Now, you're right. There are different types of crisis. We have what we call the slow burning crisis. We have the fast burning crisis. Now, slow burning crises are easier to tackle precisely because there is more time to prepare oneself and to set the mechanisms right in terms of policy making in order to be able to successfully respond to the challenges of those crises. Now, it's the fast burning ones that I think are more important in this case, where all of a sudden, a hot potato lands on the hands of the European Commission or the Council of the European Union, and they have to actually be seen in doing something about it, right? And that's where the whole sort of roller coaster starts. However, the European Union has traditionally been based on this idea of building consensus, right, in terms of reactions. So you will never see something that is radical in terms of change. You will never see something that is, a shock type of therapy, right? Thing is, in the background of European institutions, there's always working groups. There is always a degree of technocracy that operates in conjunction with the with civil servants from different member states and so on. So, in fact, what is happening in the corridors of European Union institutions is precisely this kind of preparation for something that will happen. So, effectively, what we see in the front is effectively like an iceberg. We only see like 10% of it, right, above seawater. So 90% of the work is already in prep stage before something comes out in the public sphere. So that is kind of reassuring. And of course, there are policy-making traditions that have developed within the context of the European Union that are passed on from civil servant to civil servant. So in the same context that we have ways of doing things in our national context, there are ways of doing things at the European Union level. Now, just to illustrate, Brexit never came as a shock to anyone. It was one of those slow burning crises, right? So ever since the UK joined the European Economic Communities in 1973, we have had about 40 odd years of constant blame shifting towards the European Union and this and that, and what are we Brits doing here, and we should be an independent sovereign state. So that kind of debate didn't stop in 1973, but it continued throughout the membership years of the UK in the European Union. And when the right time came, which was a combination of the European financial crisis, a combination of this kind of rise of populism, the influence from across the Atlantic as well, in terms of narratives of independence and narratives of taking back control, people were just voting in almost a 50-50 type of split between staying in and leaving. That may have come as a shock to the British government at the time, but I don't think it came as a shock to the European Union itself. So we've had already signs where the UK was distancing itself from process of the European Union. So there was, enough time from a European Union perspective to prepare oneself. And in that case, the European Union had the upper hand in any sort of negotiation agreements. Now, obviously, all this discussion around the disintegration of the European Union and so on sparkled equivalent debates around different member states. We saw how that played out, for example, in France, in the Netherlands, in Greece. There was discussion about a Grexit at some point as a result of the bankruptcy of the country. Even nowadays, there were discussions about an Italian exit, because you mentioned the case of Giorgia Meloni, for example, in Italy. That is part of the sort of far-right political spectrum, with quite colorful sort of policies around immigration and cultural purity and what have you. Well, from a political science point of view, and here is my 2 cents as a political scientist, there are responsive parties, they respond to what the people want to hear, and there are parties that become responsible once they enter government. And what we've seen so far in terms of the writing on the wall by Italy is that Meloni does not shy away from taking advantage of the fact that Italy is a member of the European Union and exploiting all the opportunities she can find in terms of securing things for her own country. So, in fact, what we see here is that there is a mismatch, a misalignment between the rhetoric and practice. Even in the context of Hungary and Poland, which have been long on the Eurosceptic side or sort of advancing more right-wing ideas. Yes, but they still are part of the European Union, and they still try to operate within that context. Now, it is part of the European Union's own modus operandi to actually develop the mechanisms to safeguard its own survival. And to a certain extent, it has been able to do that. Brexit, as you said, was a key example of make or break type of moment, and it held up. And we see now, even with war at its own doorstep, the EU is holding up pretty well as as a consolidated political system of countries that have come together bound by certain principles. And yes, of course, in the context of the war in Ukraine, we have some voices, in Hungary, for example, vetoing this, that, or the other. But in essence, they are not sidelining. They are not moving away from this kind of like common policy that the EU has set in this case.
I want to talk to you a little bit. I want to get your opinion on this. Soon as the conflict began between Russia and Ukraine, there were all these suggestions about conflict resolution, one of which being a fast track as an EU member state. How feasible is that? Obviously, we're a year into this conflict. We know that the process is a lengthy one. There are a number of chapters that need to be examined and completed in order for a country to meet the certain standards of eligibility and membership. In this case, are there any exceptions being made? Are they waiving certain chapters out of the equation? How feasible is this option of fast-tracking the Ukraine as an EU member?
First of all, I think this movement by the European Union is more a symbolic movement rather than a realization of a promise in this case. I think the point of extending the prospect of membership to the EU to Ukraine was a movement to demonstrate to Russia that these kinds of acts of aggression on the European continent are not acceptable, and that precisely Ukraine is part of the European family and the European Union as the kind of safeguard of those common principles and values of freedom, liberty, sovereignty as well, human rights and civil rights, will not stand this kind of thing at its own doorstep. So more than anything, I think it's a symbolic move to demonstrate the fact that the EU is there and it is acting as a counterbalance to Russian influence on Ukraine. Traditionally, we had pro-Russian or pro-Europhile or pro-European forces within certain countries of Eastern Europe. So I think this is just a way of putting a stamp on things and making sure that the European Union is taking a stand that could potentially diplomatically resolve this kind of crisis. I mean, if we look at the other side of the story, NATO membership, for instance, we saw how NATO membership can be fast-tracked for countries like Sweden and Finland. But this is a whole different ball game. In the context of EU membership, there is no question that if negotiations for accession go forward, that every single chapter of the acquis communautaire, as we call it, will have to be satisfied before it proceeds to membership. And of course, this is not something that will happen overnight. We are talking about at least a few decades of a process. This is quite important for the EU, because the EU should not be seen as favoring countries over others who wish to join just because the circumstances are exceptional. Countries that wish to become members of the European Union have done a lot of sacrificing, both in terms of their political capital and their social capital. If we see a country like Turkey, for example, who has been in the waiting room for at least 4 decades now, it would seem quite unfair to receive different treatment compared to Ukraine or some of the countries of the Western Balkans. But what this movement actually does is that it opens up this kind of prospect for better, let's say, association with the European Union. Maybe we can see the strengthening of commercial agreements, energy agreements, defense agreements, maybe some civil society exchanges, some administrative partnerships, and so on and so forth, that can be well extended into, say, countries of the South Caucasus, like Georgia, Azerbaijan, or Armenia. or even safeguard the sovereignty of countries like Moldova, and maybe bring some political change in countries like Belarus, which is the last effective dictatorship on the European continent. So you see, in that sense, this kind of extension of the membership prospect does not only target Ukraine as a country that is under attack by another nation, but it also creates the kind of space for other partnerships in other countries to develop, but also to give the signal that the EU is there. It is a global actor. It is an actor that can affect norms, values, and beliefs within the international system. And that, effectively, it is a good game in town rather than something that can lead to all these kinds of conflicts and problems.
I want to go back to a crisis that has already began, and certainly the European leaders are looking at it as a potential major issue to be dealt with in the years to come. And this isn't only following the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It has started way before that, certainly since the war in Syria. With massive migration going into Europe, we're seeing, of course, the tragedies that are occurring in the Mediterranean, whether it's in Greek waters or Italian waters, and certainly now with the war in Russia and Ukraine, we're seeing how devastating it is for people to leave their homes in search of a better life and of a better future. However, this does raise certain security concerns. How prepared is the EU and the different the different member states that are receiving these migrants in taking care of them? Do they have the economic infrastructure and the health and social services infrastructure as well, lodging? Are these countries prepared to take in these massive migration waves of migration into Europe?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because we are now in the process of concluding a huge research project, which was funded by the research programs of the European Commission, which looked precisely at the capacity of the European Union to handle the influx of refugees from across the board and the kind of challenges that are presented in the context of member states, specific member states. It was a consortium of 11 universities and think tanks, which took about 3.5 years to complete. And what the essence there was is that the European Union may have common policies about how to handle these kinds of refugee inflows. It may have developed certain mechanisms and may have channeled certain resources to them, to these new institutions or to the new elevated institutions. However, one thing is certain, that, and this is what our research is demonstrating, is that the actors on the ground do not have a clear interpretation of those policies, and that creates a whole host of problems in terms of the pushbacks that we've heard, the inability to salvage refugees from the sea, the ensuring and guaranteeing the safety of people crossing into Europe, but also the kind of distribution of the burden across the board, across the different member states. So in this case, there are a handful of member states that have been disproportionately affected by this crisis because they are entry points. Greece is definitely one of them. Italy is another example, but also France and Spain, because they are at the receiving end of those routes of trafficking, right? Now, the EU, in my view, needs to be able to do the following things. First of all, It needs to find a solution that manages to distribute the load and the burden of handling asylum-seeking applications and refugee applications in a more effective way. It needs to ensure that it also does its part as a global actor to try and resolve crises that are happening around its own borders. So, for example, be able to more effectively intervene, say, in the Middle East, in North Africa, to be part of the foreign aid and economic development initiatives in other countries, in promoting democracy support in those countries as well. Now, the EU does not intervene militarily. That's not something the EU does, but it has all sorts of different softer tools, such as economic diplomacy, sanctions, what have you, that can help towards that direction. And finally, what the EU needs to do is to actually accept that single member states cannot be responsible for handling this issue on their own. So, in fact, we need to see a better channeling of financial resources and instruments down to the member states that are receiving refugees, and precisely a better mechanism of cooperation with local authorities and international and national NGOs that are involved in these processes in order to improve refugees' life. What we've seen, for example, on the Greek islands and in the refugee camps is this kind of mayhem, this kind of confusion that exists between job descriptions, who does what and why, between the involvement of different NGOs and international NGOs alongside the local authorities, and of course in the system of classifying someone as a vulnerable person in order to receive refugee status or asylum seeker status. And here's where the net is not well woven to provide this kind of protection to people who actually need this kind of protection. Here we find, for example, instances of people falling through the cracks precisely because they don't have certain characteristics that are recognized as vulnerable from a direct kind of point of view. Those are invisible vulnerabilities. Of course, there are reasons why people are leaving their countries, and the legal framework, the European migration regimes, need to actually be able to acknowledge those reasons and successfully process people in that sense.
The example you gave is quite remarkable about the EU's effort in mitigating these challenges outside of its borders. But we've seen certain cases, for example, with Turkey, where the financial support was there, and yet there are arguments that Turkey has been instrumentalizing migration and forcing them into Europe. We saw the near conflict that emerged at the border with Turkey and Thrace. At the same time, when these waves of migrants were flowing through Greece, certain members, EU members in the north, had closed their border. So there seems to be either this lack of communication or this distrust of these individuals coming into the European countries, and maybe rightfully so. I mean, are there the right resources on the ground to evaluate in terms of security who is coming in? I mean, we clearly saw the effort that Turkey made in flooding EU with either Islamists or terrorists or whatever have you. I mean, they were weaponized and they were trying to enter Greece and through various channels. So do these tools, do these resources exist on the ground?
Well, one have to be creative about resources, right? So we need to think of what we actually have and how we can make best use of it. That's the essence of public policy making. However, in the context of the EU-Turkey agreement on migration flows that took place some years ago, we have seen precisely the instrumentalization of this because the EU was in need of Turkey. So in fact, I wouldn't say that Turkish leadership is stupid. They know exactly what they need to do, and they know exactly how to handle things, and how to also manipulate their own political environment to make sure that these kinds of initiatives are provide support for the leadership and so on and so forth, right? So President Erdogan really was had masterfully handled this whole deal in terms of putting the sticks and the carrots to the European Union table. Now, obviously, Turkey itself does not have a specific interest in keeping those migrants in their border. Beyond the financial kind of resources that they get from the European Union. But if we think about it, why would Turkey want to import a problem or keep these populations in its own borders? So it also wants to push this away from its own borders, and we've seen the kind of intervention that Turkey has done, for example, on the borders with Syria some years ago, and continues to do so as well. Now, in terms of how the deal played out, you could argue that there are security concerns. Of course, there is no doubt, because in every 100 people that come in, there must be one bad person that also comes in. It's just human nature in that sense. However, one should not underestimate the politics of things, precisely because here we are dealing with 27 different political contexts. Each member state has its own political debates and political concerns. In the context of Germany, for example, because you mentioned it as a country, there were fears of the rise of the far right in the context of the AfD and neo-Nazi formations and all these bits. So for Germany, politically, it made sense to be able to kind of stop this narrative of securitization that was happening around the influx of refugees. In fact, far-right forces tried to take advantage of certain incidents that happened with certain migrants against women and so on and so forth, narratives around Islamization of Europe and so on and so forth. And in other countries like Greece, for instance, we had the rise of equally of far-right formations, political formations that were actually quite militant in their essence, and creating vigilante groups operating in the center of Athens, persecuting people that were of different race, ethnicity, religion, what have you. So, in fact, we do see the political sensitivity of things, and this is why it is important to understand how the European Union can improve its mechanisms of policy response in order to be able to depoliticize certain issues and look at them from a purely humanitarian point of view, or an intervention point of view, in order to be able to improve people's lives in their countries of origin, but also make sure that they are well received when they have to be in Europe. Safety nets have to be there from a humanitarian point of view. And we also saw how different the reaction was to the Ukrainian refugees, right? So we need to make that distinction. We saw how more welcoming the European Union was to Ukrainian refugees. And one should ask themselves, why? I don't have the right answer for you in this case, but it is an issue that can be looked at and sort of see, whether people that have different backgrounds than what is considered European are easily integrated within European societies. Now, there are those narratives about the European way of life. Well, if you ask the people who invented this term, there is a whole Directorate General on the European way of life. They will tell you, we don't know what this European way of life is. I guess respecting each other and sort of tolerating each other. But they will not give you the recipe, because there is no recipe, in fact. So it is a matter of reconnecting with the fundamental principles and values that brought us together as nations within the European Union context, and realizing that, at the end of the day, we're all human and we all have a diversity of needs that need to be satisfied. And the role of the policymaker, be those national or European or international, is to actually ensure that people's well-being. And effectively, if you think about it, the purpose of being in a democracy, and yes, with their flaws and shortcomings, European Union member states are democracies, is not the rule of the majority, but how the majority can protect the minority from being run over.
Very interesting. And obviously this conversation can go on for hours. Unfortunately, I don't want to take up more of your time. I want to thank you again for your great insight and the conversation. Where can people find your work or follow you, or if there's anything that you're working on right now that you'd like to share?
Mm-hmm. So all my publications are available on Google Scholar. So if someone Googles my name there, they will come up with all of them. And of course, my university webpage. There are fortunately not many people with my name. So you can rest assured that if you Google my name, you will get me and no one else. But equally, your viewers and your listeners can also follow me on Twitter. The hashtag is coincidentally at EU Foreign Policy, and I don't represent the EU Foreign Policy. But this is what happens when you choose a handle for a class on EU Foreign Policy, and it sticks with you for the last 10 years. So that's it. That's where I am.
Thank you so much. And of course, for any information on Strategy International, anyone can visit strategyinternational.org for all that information. Thank you so much again for tuning in. Thank you, Professor, for your time again. Really much appreciated.
I would like to thank you for the kind invitation and for the excellent discussion that we've had. I hope that your viewers and followers will enjoy it.
I'm sure they will. Thank you again, and we'll see you all in the next episode.